Gospel reading this morning is from Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 to 50. They're in the New Testament, your Pew Bible, on page 13. While he was still speaking to the crowds, his mother and his brothers were standing outside, wanting to speak with him. Someone told him, "Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside, wanting to speak with you." But to the one who had told him this, Jesus replied, "Who is my mother, and who are my brothers?" And pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." Thank you. The word of the Lord.
When I was growing up in Charlotte, North Carolina, my mom had this bright red ceramic jar with the word cookies in large white letters across the front. It was probably the first word I ever learned as a child, at least certainly the first word I ever learned to say, cookie, right? Ever since I could read and understand that word, cookie, I would always take off that lid. Even if I had to climb up on my little stool, I'd take off that lid and look inside, hoping to find one. Now, you would have think I'd have outgrown this. Wrong. Some years later, my father began putting his spare bolts and screws and washers and hex nuts plus other little spare items from his pockets into that jar. My mom kept the cookies in the cupboard there and kept them fresh, not in the jar. Yet, up to the time when my parents sold their house around 2011, I would go and visit and take the lid off that jar whenever I went and look inside, hoping that maybe one day I would find cookies instead of nuts and bolts and washers. I mean, it said cookies on it, right? I thought maybe Mom would change her mind. Take out all the hardware and put in the goodware, that good stuff. When something is given a label or a name, it is hard for us to accept that it might be something else other than what we want it to be or what we understand it to be, right? Christian is one of those words. Christian, it is a strong label carrying multiple and often conflicting assumptions. But an even stronger word than Christian is the word family, a label that assumes an alliance in which the links are not forged by religious belief, but by blood. We have a choice to the religious labels we adopt or fail to adopt, by which we are known in the world or known to others. But we are given our family name. We join ourselves to other identities of this world, and there are countless identities that we join ourselves to, but we are born into the label that identifies our family. This is an inescapable fact of life. Or is it? Or is it? While Jesus was speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told them they were outside, "Who is my mother? And who are my brothers?" That was a radical question. To understand the radical nature of Jesus' words, we have to understand the absolute obligation that the word family carried with it in Jesus' day. The family, the household, was the center of life in the Judaic and Roman world of the first century. The householder had the absolute power of life and death over all those within his, and I do emphasize the male gender, his house. Now, that wasn't as much true for the Roman world, but it was certainly true for the Jewish culture of the first century. Only men could be head of the house. Jesus was the oldest sibling in his family. And since Joseph was not on the scene, and most scholars believe Joseph had died, Jesus had an absolute and legal obligation to his mother Mary and his brothers and his sisters. He was the head of that household. And that was a huge job, many demands. That is why it is not surprising that in this story from Matthew, Jesus' family sought him out in the midst of his ministry as he traveled from village to village in Galilee and in Judea, teaching and preaching. They sought him out. And that's what happens here. To the listeners who were surrounding Christ that day, Jesus had no choice but to immediately walk away from his teaching, walk away from those who were listening to him, walk away from his disciples, and accept the responsibility of the label family. If Jesus refused to get up and comply with the summons of his family, it would be an embarrassing impropriety. But we know Jesus was always baffling his critics by changing the terms and the labels that dictated the actions of his culture, that dictated the actions of human society. And in this case, in this story, he totally redefined the meaning of the word family. He made it into something else. But to the one who had told him this, Jesus replied, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother, and is my sister, and is my mother." For Jesus, family became not a kinship of blood, but a spiritual kinship. On the surface, his words sound harsh and unfeeling. I mean, we cannot even imagine how Mary and Jesus' brothers and sisters must have reacted to this. We don't know. I mean, no one really gives us much insight into their relationship except the Gospel of John. And if we read John carefully, we realize they did not always have the best relationship. They didn't. It's a family, right? And they had family problems. But instead, Jesus was giving the label family a transcendent meaning. He robbed the word of its legal and, most importantly, its cultural context, recreating that word family into a word that simply means love. Love. A word that, as we know, does not apply to all families, does it? To do God's will is to show love for God. To show love for God is to show love for his Son, Jesus. And it is love alone that, for Jesus, defines the word family, a true family of true love. Does the word family still carry its own cultural baggage? You think so? The cultural burdens of this one word have produced division and dysfunction that have fomented ideological, political, and personal boundaries. We hear it every day, especially in this election season. The word family is bounced around all over the place. We hear it. Still carries powerful, powerful images. For example, the contrast between the image of marriage and family that media depicted in one generation, such as mine, has burdened subsequent generations with a demand for unrealistic expectations. We don't live in the time when I grew up being a family. We don't live in that time anymore. And frankly, there were a lot of problems with being a family in my time. A lot of problems, like there are today. But if we understand the word family as love, love raised to the ethical, compassionate, and sacrificial quality of God's love for us, then the meaning of family becomes transcendent, resulting not in disappointment or disillusion or dysfunction, but in faith and hope and peace. Now, I know that sounds idealistic, but it's not. When facing a rebellious child, a parent can still have faith because God never abandons our children. In the face of marital problems or a marital breakup, a spouse can still find hope because God forgives and understands and renews our lives whether we're married or not. Makes no difference. As a child or a family of children struggle with an aging, sick, or dying parent, there is still peace because God helps us find the strength and a way for each day, even in the midst of those terribly burdensome times. When Jesus declares that his disciples are his mother and his brothers, he is creating an association of individuals bound to each other, not by culture, but by love. A people whose obligation to each other are grounded not in the issues or expectations of the day, not in a legal document, or even by birth, but grounded in the teachings of Jesus Christ and our love for and obedience to those teachings. Communion, the Lord's Supper, is the place and the time when the family of Christ gathers to share the spiritual food of hope. The Church of Jesus Christ is a transcendent community. It is made up of one family who share one identity. We are all sinners, and Christ died for every one of us. That makes you and I and every believer in the world brothers and sisters under the love of the same heavenly parent. A parent who never fails to care for us. A parent who always provides, maybe not what we want, but what we need. Jesus said, "For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." So our question is, what is the will of our Father in heaven? It is this, that no matter what else defines our lives, we treat each other like a mother, a brother, a sister, or a father should be treated, with simple love, overwhelming compassion, and absolute forgiveness. That is the family that you and I are invited to join at this table this morning. In Matthew, Jesus asked the question, "Who are my brothers?" And this morning, as we gather here, Jesus asks us, Who are your brothers? Who are your sisters? Who are your parents? And we can provide Jesus that answer only through the love we give to and give from this family that calls itself Christian, that calls itself the church, that calls itself Trinity. At the end of our lives, when God opens our cookie jars, I hope he finds not nuts and bolts and washers and other flotsam and jetsam from our lives, but I hope he finds love that we're willing to share with all the world. Amen.